Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're pulling back the curtain on some really fascinating economic thinking, specifically from Steven N.S. Cheung and his book Economic Explanation.
Yeah, this isn't just dry theory. Cheung's work is this blend of sharp economic analysis and, well, real-world observation, even personal stories.
Absolutely. So, our mission here is to really get inside Cheung's approach. We want to unpack his core ideas, things like property rights, transaction costs, contract theory.
Key concepts for him.
Definitely. And then see how he used these ideas to understand really big shifts, especially something like China's economic reforms.
It's about seeing how a different lens can make complex things seem, maybe not simple, but clearer.
Clearer, exactly. Like putting on those special glasses you mentioned.
Right, the ones that show the hidden economic plumbing.
I love that. Okay, so Steven Cheung, where does his unique view come from? His background seems pretty important.
Oh, absolutely crucial. He wasn't just, working in isolation. He studied under some real giants. People like Armin Elkian, Jack Hirschleifer, Milton Friedman.
Wow, that's a list.
And really importantly for these ideas, Ronald Coase, mainly at UCLA in Chicago. These were hubs of really innovative thinking.
And Coase himself said Cheung wasn't just a parrot, right? He took these ideas and really made them his own.
Exactly. Coase noted that. Cheung absorbed, but he synthesized and pushed further. And the big push was towards the empirical, towards looking at the world, gathering actual evidence.
So grounding the theory in reality.
Yes. He seemed maybe a bit impatient with economics that stayed purely abstract. He wanted to test ideas against how things actually worked. Less theoretical elegance, perhaps, more observable facts.
You can sort of see why when you look at his own life experiences he talks about.
Totally. Like experiencing price controls firsthand during the war in Hong Kong. That's not a graph in a textbook. That's seeing the chaos and unintended consequences play out.
Must have left a mark.
For sure. And he mentions his mother having great business sense, being able to explain things clearly. That practical side seems to have rubbed off.
And that story about the fishing rod.
Yeah, that's a great one. His father gives him a rod, not fish. The idea being guidance, but figure it out yourself. Cheung saw that as how he learned seek direction, but do the hard work of discovery.
Like a treasure hunt for knowledge, pulling bits from everywhere.
He really did see it that way. And even early observations like watching that manager, McManus, supervising workers with a pole and Guilin.
Just a simple observation, but
And for Cheung, it was a concrete early lesson about management, about monitoring costs. These aren't just charming anecdotes. They show his deep commitment to starting with what you could actually see.
it's like his whole life pointed him towards valuing the observable, the tangible, which connects to what he called the surging tide in economics.
Yes, exactly. He saw this major shift happening, maybe mid-20th century onwards, economics moving from just saying what should happen normative stuff toward trying to explain what does happen, positive analysis.
Less prescribing, more understanding the why.
That's the surging tide, trying to figure out the mechanisms based on evidence. And the core tools he used for that explanation were, as you said, property rights and transaction costs.
Right, the things often just assumed away in simpler models, like friction doesn't exist, rights are perfectly clear.
Which is rarely true in the real world. Cheung, really building on Toast here, argued that if you don't have clear, enforceable property rights, or if the costs of making and enforcing deals, the transaction costs, are high.
Then you get outcomes that look like problems. Things people call market failures.
Exactly, like pollution, overuse of resources, all that stuff, often labeled externalities.
The traditional response might be tax the externality, a Pigovian tax.
Right, but Cheung and Coase would say, hang on, why is that externality happening?
Maybe it's because nobody clearly owns the resource being affected, like clean air or a fish stock.
Or maybe the cost of getting everyone involved to negotiate a private solution is just way too high. Precisely. The problem isn't necessarily inherent market failure. It might be the lack of defined rights or prohibitive transaction costs that stop the market mechanism from working smoothly through contracts.
The sources use that marine fisheries example, right?
Yeah, it's a classic. If the fishing ground is open access, no single fisherman has much incentive to hold back. Why should they if someone else will just catch the fish they leave?
You can't easily make a contract with every single potential fisher out there.
The transaction costs are astronomical. So without enforceable rights or a feasible contract, individual rational behavior leads to overfishing. The externality is a symptom of those underlying institutional problems.
That framework makes a lot more sense of it. And focusing on contracts leads naturally to his work on sharecropping, doesn't it?
It really does,
Yeah.
because if property rights and transaction costs shape interactions, they must also shape the types of contracts people choose.
Then sharecropping was a big one for him.
Huge. Shared tenancy, where the landlord and tenant split the output, was often seen by economists as, well, inefficient. The thinking was, if the tenant only gets, say, half the extra crop they produce, they won't work as hard as if they paid a fixed rent and kept all the extra. They'd shirk.
Makes intuitive sense, I guess.
But Cheung looked at actual sharecropping arrangements, gathered data, and found that, hold on, this view might be too simplistic. He argued that when you account for transaction costs and risk, sharecropping can be a very efficient contract.
How so?
Well, think about it. Maybe it's hard for the landlord to monitor exactly how hard the tenant is working. Or maybe predicting the harvest size is really uncertain due to weather or pests. High transaction costs, high risk.
Okay.
In that situation, a share contract does two things. It gives the tenant some incentive, they still get a share, and crucially, it shares the risk between the landlord and the tenant. If the harvest fails, both suffer, unlike a fixed rent where the tenant bears all the risk.
So it's a risk management tool as much as an incentive structure.
Exactly. The choice between fixed rent and share depends on balancing those incentive effects against risk sharing and the costs of monitoring and enforcement.
And the sources mentioned specific examples from China.
Yeah, fascinating details, different ways of splitting the crop, rules about inputs, land size, and clever clauses like that escape clause in some fixed rent deals.
The one for famine years.
Right. If there's a famine, the fixed rent is reduced. Cheung saw this not just as charity, but as a contractual feature. The tenant might pay a slightly higher rent in normal years.
Like an insurance premium.
Exactly, an insurance premium for the security of lower rent if disaster strikes. It's built into the contract. He also looked at lease length. Longer leases might mean lower costs from frequent renegotiation.
So the takeaway is that these complex contracts aren't backward or inefficient. They're often smart adaptations to real-world frictions.
That's his core insight. They evolved to handle transaction costs and risk. And it's not just farming. You see similar share-based arrangements elsewhere.
Like where?
Retail stores where the manager gets a share of profits, hair salons, gas stations, sometimes even fishing boats where the crew gets a share of the catch. Same underlying logic.
Okay, this is powerful stuff. Let's scale it up. How does this lens help us understand something truly massive, like Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China? The sources call it a great transformation.
And it really was a huge natural experiment in a way. Cheung's framework is incredibly useful here. Take the agricultural responsibility system.
The first big reform.
Yeah. Fundamentally, it was a shift towards contractual arrangements, much like sharecropping or fixed-rent farming at the household level. It gave families clearer rights to the output of their effort, the residual claim.
So better defined property rights, clearer incentives.
And boom, agricultural output surged. It was remarkable. Then you had reforms starting in industrial labor,
Privatizing jobs.
starting that process, and you saw predictable effects. Wages for those workers started to rise relative to others, but also, as the old iron rice bowl system dissolved, unemployment emerged. That was a new phenomenon.
And dealing with prices must have been incredibly tricky. Decades of controls.
Hugely sensitive. The sources mention that meeting with Zhao Ziyang, Deng's associate, where Milton Friedman apparently advised faster liberalization than maybe others felt was politically feasible.
Shows the real-world political constraints.
Absolutely. And the sources do note, impartially, that some link the price increases that occurred during reforms to the social tensions around the Tiananmen incident. It just highlights the immense friction involved in unwinding such a system.
What about the big state-owned companies? Privatizing those sounds like a nightmare.
A massive challenge, and one that continued for years. Lots of them kept making losses. The sources talk about different ideas, like shareholding schemes.
And they use that Fiat car analogy.
Yeah, it's a good one. Owning a car isn't just having the metal object. It's the right to use it, sell it, rent it out, paint it purple. Transferring ownership of a huge state enterprise means transferring that whole complex bundle of rights. Much harder than just handing over car keys.
Makes the complexity very clear.
Then there was finance, the dual currency system, the FEC for foreigners, and the RMB. A black market quickly showed the real exchange rate.
Because transaction costs of using the official system were too high or didn't reflect reality.
Exactly, until eventually they moved towards floating the currency. Cheung analyzed that whole process through his lens.
The sources also mention corruption. How does that fit in?
Well, the analysis presented links it to the existing power structures, the hierarchical system interacting with the new opportunities, and changed incentives created by the reforms. Again, it's presented as an observed phenomenon within that complex transition, not taking a political stance.
So looking back at Deng's reforms through Cheung's framework, it really emphasizes the fundamental role of getting those property rights and contract structures right, even amidst all the political and social upheaval.
It shows how powerful those underlying economic incentives are when they're unleashed, even partially. It was an incredible, messy, but ultimately transformative period.
Okay, let's bring it home. Why should someone listening now care about Stephen Cheung, or sharecropping contracts from decades ago, or China's specific reforms? What's the relevance for you?
I think it's because Cheung gives you a really practical toolkit for understanding the economic world around you today and cuts through a lot of the jargon
So.
by forcing you to ask, what are the actual rules of the game here? Who owns what? What rights do they really have? And what does it cost people to interact, to make deals, to enforce them, those transaction costs?
So instead of just seeing, say, a complex employment contract or a weird business practice and shrugging,
You start thinking, okay, why is it structured that way? What problem might this structure be solving related to monitoring or risk or information? It helps you decode the economic reality.
it helps you see the why behind the what.
Exactly. It applies to gig economy platforms, online marketplaces, environmental regulations, intellectual property disputes, you name it. It's about understanding the incentives and constraints shaped by rights and costs.
It really is like getting those special glasses to see the underlying plumbing.
That's the goal.
So this deep dive took us through Stephen Cheung's economic explanation, from his empirical roots and influential teachers.
To his core ideas: property rights, transaction costs, the nature of the firm, contract theory.
And we saw how these ideas illuminate everything from agricultural contracts like sharecropping to the enormous economic transformation in China.
It really hammers home that understanding the details of incentives, rights, and the frictions those transaction costs is key to grasping why economies function, or sometimes dysfunction, the way they do.
Okay, to wrap up, here's something to chew on, drawing from our sources. If markets and firms and all these complex contracts we see only really exist because transaction costs are not zero.
Because if everything were costless, maybe simple price signals would be enough.
Right. So if these institutions are fundamentally responses to friction, what does that imply about attempts to regulate or intervene in the economy that might perhaps implicitly assume those frictions away? What happens when policy ignores the very costs that shape the system it's trying to influence?